There are moments in life when something shifts quietly within us before anything changes on the outside. A subtle awareness begins to grow, almost like a whisper beneath the noise of daily survival. We start noticing patterns, emotions, and longings that we may have ignored or suppressed for years. Love, real love, doesn't just arrive randomly. It often finds us when we are being gently prepared for it. Not because we suddenly become worthy, but because we begin to see ourselves more truthfully. When God is about to send someone who truly loves you, it's not just an external event, it's an internal transformation. It's your nervous system softening, your defenses loosening, your heart learning that it might finally be safe to receive what it has always needed. Can make mistakes or respond poorly, and there comes a point where the noise of shallow interactions no longer feels tolerable, even if for years you participated in them without question. Conversations that once seemed normal now feel empty, repetitive, almost exhausting in a way that is difficult to explain to others. It is not that people around you have suddenly changed, but your awareness has deepened. You begin to notice how much of what is exchanged lacks presence, lacks sincerity, lacks emotional truth. The laughter feels forced, the attention feels temporary, and the connections feel conditional. Instead of energizing you, these interactions begin to drain you, leaving behind a quiet fatigue that lingers even after the moment is past. This emotional tiredness is not a weakness, it is a signal. It reflects a growing sensitivity within you, an awakening to your own unmet needs for authenticity, depth, and genuine care. Where you may have once tolerated inconsistency, mixed signals, or emotional unavailability, you now find yourself unable to ignore how these experiences affect you internally. There is a discomfort that arises when you betray your own need for something real, and that discomfort becomes harder to silence. You might even feel conflicted because part of you still seeks connection, while another part resists anything that feels less than meaningful. This shift often brings a sense of isolation. You may find yourself pulling back from social circles, not out of arrogance, but out of a quiet recognition that something is missing. It can feel as though you no longer fit into spaces that once felt familiar. There is a grieving process here, even if it is subtle, the loss of what you thought connection was, and the realization that it did not truly nourish you. This grief is not about others alone, it is also about the ways you may have abandoned your own emotional truth in order to maintain those connections. As this awareness grows, you begin to see patterns more clearly. You recognize how often interactions were based on convenience rather than care, on distraction rather than presence. You might notice how quickly people come and go, how little effort is made to truly understand one another, how easily emotional depth is avoided. These realizations can feel heavy, but they are also clarifying. They bring you closer to understanding what you truly long for, even if you cannot yet fully articulate it. There is also a quiet shift in your tolerance. Things that once seemed acceptable now feel misaligned. You become less willing to engage in conversations that lack substance, less interested in relationships that feel one-sided or emotionally distant. This does not necessarily make you more critical of others, rather, it makes you more honest with yourself. You begin to recognize the cost of staying in connections that do not meet you where you are, and that cost becomes too significant to ignore. At the same time, this emotional tiredness creates space. When you step away from what is superficial, even if it feels uncomfortable at first, you open the possibility for something deeper to enter your life. This space is not immediately filled. That can feel unsettling. There may be moments of loneliness, moments where you question whether your expectations are too high or whether something is wrong with you. But beneath that questioning, there is also a quiet knowing that you are no longer willing to settle for less than what feels real. In this process, you are not just rejecting superficial connections, you are redefining what connection means to you. You are learning, often through discomfort, that your emotional needs matter, that your desire for depth is valid, and that love, true love, cannot be built on anything less than authenticity. This tiredness then is not an endpoint but a transition, a movement away from what no longer serves you and towards something that aligns more closely with who you are becoming. You begin to notice parts of yourself that you once avoided, not because they suddenly appeared, but because your awareness has become more honest and less distracted. There is a quiet turning inward where your attention is no longer fully consumed by external validation or constant activity. Instead, you start observing your own emotional reactions with a kind of curiosity. You see how certain situations trigger you, how certain words linger longer than they should, how familiar patterns repeat themselves in different forms. What once felt random now begins to feel connected, almost like a story you are slowly learning to read. This awareness can feel uncomfortable at first. It is not easy to recognize the wounds you carry, especially when they have been hidden beneath layers of coping mechanisms. You may start to see how you seek approval, how you fear abandonment, or how you protect yourself by staying emotionally distant. These patterns are not flaws in the way you once believed, they are adaptations, ways your mind and body learned to survive in moments when something essential was missing. As you begin to see this, there is often a mix of emotions, confusion, sadness, even a sense of vulnerability that feels unfamiliar. You might notice how your past experiences still shape your present reactions. A small moment of rejection may feel disproportionately painful, not because of what is happening now, but because it touches something unresolved from before. You begin to understand that your responses are not just about the current situation. They are echoes of earlier experiences that have not yet been fully processed. This realization can shift the way you see yourself. Instead of judging your reactions, you start to question them with more compassion, asking where they come from rather than why they exist. There is also a growing recognition of the roles you have played in your relationships. You may see how you have overextended yourself to be accepted, how you have ignored your own needs to avoid conflict, or how you have stayed in situations that did not truly honor you. These insights can be difficult to sit with because they challenge the narratives you may have held about yourself. Yet they also offer something important: a sense of clarity. You begin to see that these patterns are not fixed, they are learned, and what is learned can be unlearned. As this process continues, you become more attuned to your emotional landscape. You start to notice subtle shifts within yourself, moments when you feel anxious without a clear reason, moments when you withdraw, moments when you long for connection but hesitate to reach out. Instead of dismissing these experiences, you begin to acknowledge them. There is a quiet acceptance that these feelings are part of you, not something to be pushed away or ignored. This awareness also changes the way you relate to others. You become more sensitive to emotional dynamics, more aware of how interactions affect you. You may find yourself pausing before reacting, questioning whether your response is coming from the present moment or from an older wound. This pause creates a space where you can choose differently, even if that choice is not always clear or easy. At times, this journey inward can feel isolating. When you start to see your patterns more clearly, it may feel as though you are carrying something that others do not fully understand. You may struggle to express what you are experiencing, or feel that your inner world has become more complex than before. Yet within that complexity, there is also a quiet unfolding. You are beginning to meet yourself more honestly, without the same level of avoidance that once protected you. In becoming aware of your wounds and patterns, you are not becoming broken, you are becoming conscious. You are recognizing the ways you have adapted, the ways you have protected yourself, and the ways you have longed for something more. This awareness does not immediately resolve everything, but it changes your relationship with yourself. It allows you to see that your experiences have shaped you, but they do not have to define the direction you move in from here. There is a subtle but profound shift that begins to take place in the way you relate to your own limits. Where you may have once said yes out of obligation, fear, or the need to be accepted, you now start to pause. That pause is not always comfortable because it interrupts a familiar pattern. You begin to notice the tension that arises in your body when you agree to something that does not feel right, the quiet resistance that you used to ignore. This awareness makes it harder to continue betraying your own needs, even in small ways. At first, setting boundaries can feel unfamiliar, almost unnatural. You may worry about how others will perceive you, whether they will see you as selfish, distant, or unkind. These concerns often come from earlier experiences where your needs may not have been fully respected, or where love felt conditional on your ability to accommodate others. Because of this, saying no can carry an emotional weight that goes beyond the present moment. It may feel like you are risking connection even when what you are actually doing is protecting it in a healthier way. Despite this discomfort, something within you begins to shift. You start to recognize that constantly overextending yourself leads to a kind of quiet resentment, not only toward others but also toward yourself. There is a realization that when you ignore your own limits, you are participating in your own exhaustion. This recognition is not about blaming yourself, but about seeing more clearly the role you play in your own emotional well-being. With that clarity, the idea of setting boundaries becomes less about rejecting others and more about honoring yourself. As you begin to practice this, even in small ways, you may notice a change in how you feel internally. There is a sense of alignment that comes from acting in accordance with your own needs, even if it is accompanied by initial discomfort. You might still feel a pull to revert to old habits, to smooth things over, to avoid conflict. But alongside that pull, there is now another voice, quieter but more grounded, reminding you that your needs are valid. This internal dialogue becomes part of the process, not something to eliminate, but something to understand. You may also start to see how people respond to your boundaries, and this can be revealing. Some individuals will respect your limits, even if they need time to adjust. Others may react with confusion, resistance, or even frustration. These reactions can be difficult to face, especially if you are used to maintaining harmony at any cost. Yet they also provide important information about the dynamics of your relationships. You begin to see who is able to meet you with understanding and who is more invested in the version of you that had fewer limits. In this process, guilt often arises. It can feel as though you are doing something wrong simply by choosing yourself. This guilt is not necessarily a reflection of reality, but rather a reflection of conditioning of having learned, perhaps early on, that your worth was tied to how much you could give, how much you could tolerate, how much you could adapt. As you continue to set boundaries, you may start to question this belief. You may begin to see that caring for yourself does not diminish your capacity to care for others. It changes the way that care is expressed. There is also a growing sense of responsibility that comes with this shift. You realize that setting boundaries is not about controlling others, but about being clear with yourself and with those around you. It involves recognizing your limits and communicating them, even when it feels uncomfortable. This clarity can create a different kind of connection, one that is not based on silent expectations or unspoken sacrifices, but on mutual understanding. Over time, as you continue to practice setting boundaries without the same level of guilt, something begins to settle within you. The act of honoring your limits becomes less of a struggle and more of a natural response. You are no longer constantly negotiating your worth through your willingness to give. Instead, you are learning to exist in a way that includes your own needs as part of the equation. Not as an afterthought, there is a quiet shift that begins to take place in your relationship with time, especially when it comes to love and connection. Where there may have once been urgency, even a subtle sense of pressure to find someone, to be chosen, to not feel left behind, that intensity begins to soften. It is not that the desire for love disappears, but the desperation that once accompanied it starts to loosen its grip. You begin to notice that you are no longer chasing in the same way, no longer trying to force outcomes or rush processes that are not ready to unfold. This sense of patience does not come from external reassurance, but from something internal that has started to stabilize. You begin to trust, even if only slightly at first, that what is meant for you does not require constant striving or emotional exhaustion. There is a growing awareness that the kind of love you seek cannot be built through urgency or fear, and that realization changes how you approach relationships. Instead of trying to secure connection as quickly as possible, you become more willing to let things develop at their own pace. At times, this shift can feel unfamiliar, even unsettling. If you have been used to equating intensity with love, or urgency with importance, then you have been used to equating life with love, or life with importance. The absence of those feelings might make you question whether something is missing. You may wonder why you are not as emotionally reactive as before, why you are not overanalyzing every interaction or seeking constant validation. Yet beneath that questioning, there is also a sense of calm that feels different from anything you have experienced in this context before. You begin to recognize that desperation often came from a place of fear of being alone, fear of not being enough, fear of missing out on something that others seem to have. As you become more aware of these fears, they start to lose some of their power. You see that rushing into connections did not necessarily protect you from these feelings, but often intensified them. This realization allows you to step back, not as a form of avoidance, but as a way of creating space for something more grounded to emerge. There is also a growing ability to sit with uncertainty. You become less inclined to seek immediate answers about where things are going or what someone feels about you. Instead of trying to control the outcome, you begin to observe the process. You pay attention to how you feel in someone's presence, how they show up over time, how the connection evolves naturally. This shift in focus moves you away from seeking reassurance and toward experiencing the relationship as it unfolds. As this patience deepens, you may notice that your choices begin to change. You are less likely to engage in situations that feel rushed or forced, less willing to ignore inconsistencies in order to maintain a connection. There is a growing sense that you do not need to convince someone to see your value or to stay. This does not come from a place of indifference, but from a recognition that genuine connection cannot be manufactured through effort alone. At the same time, this patience is not passive. It is an active process of allowing, of staying present with your own experience without trying to escape it. You are still open to love, still capable of longing, but that longing is no longer driven by the same sense of urgency. It becomes quieter, more grounded, less overwhelming. You are able to hold the desire for connection alongside a sense of inner stability, rather than feeling consumed by it. There may still be moments where old patterns resurface, where impatience or doubt creeps in. This is part of the process, not a sign that the shift is not real. What changes is how you relate to those moments. Instead of being carried away by them, you are more likely to notice them, to understand where they come from, and to let them pass without acting on them in the same way. In this growing sense of patience, there is a subtle reorientation of trust, not necessarily a blind belief that everything will work out perfectly, but a quiet confidence that you do not need to rush your way into love in order to experience it. You begin to see that the right connection will not require you to abandon your sense of self or to move faster than what feels true to you. And that recognition starts to shape the way you show up in your relationships and within your own inner world. There is a quiet but noticeable shift in the way you relate to people who once held a certain presence in your life. It is not dramatic, not something that necessarily involves confrontation or clear endings, but rather a gradual loosening of attachment. You begin to feel less emotionally entangled in dynamics that used to consume your attention. The conversations may still happen, the interactions may still occur, but something within you is no longer as invested in the same way. There is a growing awareness of how certain connections affect your energy, and that awareness changes how much of yourself you are willing to give. You start to notice the subtle exhaustion that follows interactions with people who drain you. It may not always be obvious in the moment, but afterward there is a heaviness, a sense of depletion that lingers. You might feel misunderstood, overlooked, or emotionally unsettled without being able to point to a specific reason. Over time, these patterns become clearer. You begin to recognize that it is not just a one-time experience, but a consistent dynamic that leaves you feeling diminished rather than supported. This recognition does not immediately lead to action. At first, there may be an internal conflict. Part of you may still feel a sense of loyalty, obligation, or familiarity with these individuals. You may question whether you are being too sensitive, whether you are expecting too much, or whether the issue lies within you. This questioning is part of the process, especially if you have spent a long time normalizing these dynamics. It takes time to fully trust your own experience, to accept that the way you feel in someone's presence is meaningful and worthy of attention. As your awareness deepens, the pull toward these draining connections begins to weaken. You may find yourself naturally engaging less, not out of resentment, but out of a growing need to protect your own emotional space. The effort it once took to maintain these relationships starts to feel disproportionate to what you receive in return. There is a realization that connection should not consistently come at the cost of your well-being, and that realization makes it harder to continue participating in the same way. This detachment is not about rejecting others or seeing them as inherently negative. It is more about recognizing what aligns with you and what does not. You begin to see that people act from their own patterns, their own limitations, and that their inability to meet you in a certain way is not necessarily a reflection of your worth. This understanding allows you to step back without the same level of emotional intensity, without needing to prove anything or to seek validation from those who cannot offer it. There is also a shift in how you respond within these interactions. Where you may have once tried to fix, to explain, or to gain understanding, you now feel less compelled to engage at that level. You might listen, but you do not absorb in the same way. You might respond, but without the same emotional investment. This change can feel subtle from the outside, but internally it represents a significant movement towards self-preservation. At times, this process can feel lonely. Letting go, even gradually, of familiar connections can create a sense of emptiness. There may be moments where you miss the closeness, even if that closeness was inconsistent or unfulfilling. This is a natural part of detachment, the space that forms when something is released but not yet replaced. It requires a certain tolerance for discomfort, a willingness to sit with that space without rushing to fill it with something similar. As you continue to detach, you may begin to notice an increase in clarity. Without the constant influence of draining interactions, your mind feels less crowded, your emotions less reactive. You have more energy to direct toward yourself, toward things that nourish you rather than deplete you. This clarity reinforces the shift, making it easier to maintain distance where it is needed. You are not cutting people off in a harsh or abrupt way, but rather allowing your energy to realign with what feels sustainable and true. The connections that once required constant effort begin to fade into the background, not because you force them out, but because they no longer hold the same place within you. There are moments that begin to emerge in your life that feel different from anything you have previously experienced, not because they are dramatic or overwhelming, but because of their simplicity. A quiet sense of calm appears without a clear external reason. You may be sitting alone, walking, or simply existing in an ordinary moment, and yet there is a subtle feeling of ease within you. It is not tied to achievement, validation, or the presence of someone else. It arises on its own, almost unexpectedly, and it carries a quality of stillness that feels unfamiliar at first. This inner peace does not come as a constant state. It appears in brief moments, sometimes fleeting, but noticeable enough to leave an impression. You begin to recognize that these moments are not dependent on circumstances aligning perfectly. Even when life is uncertain, even when not everything is resolved, there is still the possibility of feeling grounded within yourself. This realization can be surprising, especially if you have spent much of your life associating peace with external security or the presence of others. As these moments occur more frequently, you start to trust them. You begin to see that peace is not something you have to chase or earn, but something that can arise when you are no longer resisting your own experience. There is a softening that takes place within you, a reduction in the constant inner tension that may have once defined your emotional state. You are not as caught in cycles of overthinking, not as reactive to every shift in your environment. Instead, there is a growing ability to remain present, even when things are not entirely clear. This peace also changes how you relate to your thoughts. You may still experience doubt, worry, or uncertainty, but they no longer dominate in the same way. There is a slight distance between you and your thoughts, a space that allows you to observe, rather than immediately react. This shift creates a sense of stability, even when your mind is active. You are less likely to be pulled into every narrative, less inclined to believe every fear as an absolute truth. At times, this calmness can feel almost unfamiliar, especially if you are used to emotional intensity. You may find yourself questioning it, wondering if something is missing or if you are becoming indifferent. But as you sit with it, you begin to notice that it is not emptiness, it is a different kind of fullness. It is a state where you are not constantly seeking, not constantly trying to fill a gap. Instead, there is a quiet contentment that exists alongside your desires, rather than being overshadowed by them. This inner peace also influences the way you connect with others. You are less driven by the need for immediate reassurance, less likely to seek validation in order to feel stable. When you interact with people, you bring a different energy, one that is not rooted in urgency or dependency. This does not mean you no longer care or desire connection, but that your sense of self is not entirely dependent on it. You are able to engage without losing yourself in the process. There is also a growing acceptance of uncertainty. You begin to understand that not everything needs to be figured out right away, that clarity can unfold over time. This acceptance reduces the pressure you place on yourself and on your experiences. You become more open to allowing things to develop naturally without forcing conclusions or outcomes. This openness creates space for something new to enter your life, something that aligns with the calmness you are beginning to cultivate within yourself. These moments of peace serve as a kind of internal signal, not loud or forceful, but steady. They reflect a shift in how you are relating to yourself and to your life. You are no longer operating solely from a place of lack or fear, but from a place that includes a sense of sufficiency, even if it is still developing. This does not eliminate challenges or difficult emotions, but it changes the foundation from which you experience them, allowing you to remain more grounded even as things continue to evolve.